I'd like to thank the Scientific Committee for allowing me to present this case presentation on Bracken Toxicosis. Whilst I'm currently residing in Australia, this is actually a UK-based case report. So the case in question occurred in the northwest of England in the county of Cumbria. It occurred on a beef unit where animals were purchased at 6 months old and taken through to about 18 months old before being sold on for feedlotting. About 1900 animals were present on this premise at any given time. And the farm in question extended to about 15,000 feet above sea level, with quite a large amount of extensive grazing facilities on the farm. Animals were housed during the winter months between October and April and fed a total mixed ration and grazed during the summer months. This case report actually occurred in June, so during the summer period in the Northern Hemisphere. So I was called to examine 2 animals out of a group of 40 Albion Angus Cross Charolais heifers, which had been treated the previous 24 hours by the client. He had noticed both animals to be depressed, a little bit quiet, and to be exhibiting increased respiratory rate and effort. He assumed they had bovine respiratory disease and treated them both for bovine respiratory disease using subcutaneous meloxicam and fluorophenical. These animals had been on the premises for approximately 10 weeks. They had come as a group of 40 from one premise in the very north of Scotland, and during this time period had been grazed on extensive reclaimed hill pasture. Up to that point, there was no history of any ill animals or any morbidity at all within the group. Clinical examination of both animals was very similar. Both were parexic, both were tachycardic, tachypneic, both exhibited signs of anemia. There was diffuse wheezes and crackles, all lung fields, particularly cranioventral. One animal had quite a significant scleral hemorrhage in both eyes. Both animals had quite a large quantity of fresh blood being passed in the feces. And interestingly, heifer number 2 was still bleeding from the subcutaneous injection sites from the previous 24 hours when the client had administered treatment. Blood samples were taken from both individuals. They were very similar, so I've presented one of the findings here. And what we're seeing in this clinical picture is evidence of acute hematological crisis and what I would term a pancytopenia, where we've got a total reduction in red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So this picture was very similar for the other animal. Given the clinical findings present, I elected to undertake blood transfusion in both these individuals. Donor animals were selected on the following criteria. There was no reported illness in those animals from the client. They were from a different management group from the group where the 2 clinical animals had been isolated. And both were normal on clinical examination findings. 4 litres of blood were transfused into each affected animal. And both affected animals were treated with 20 milligrams per kilogram of intravenous oxytetracycline. No non-steroidal anti-inflammatory was given at that point, given the hematological findings we were seeing and given the passage of blood, just for the risk of any abomasal ulceration and intestinal ulceration. Initially, 12 to 18 hours after transfusion, there was a significant improvement in both animals. One of the animals started to eat. The other one increased its drinking behavior, and both became much more ambulatory, moving around the box, much more responsive, and initially seemed to be moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, over the next 24 to 36 hours, there was marked deterioration. Both animals progressed to frank foul smell and melena. Both became recumbent, and at that point, a decision was made to euthanize on humane grounds. Necropsy findings in both animals were very similar and quite profound and remarkable. The pictures in the following slides are from a mixture of both animals. Such were similarities between the cases. You can see we've got extensive intestinal bleeding. So we've got large intestinal hemorrhage, small intestinal hemorrhage, and the bottom left, that's the cecum. You can see the degree of hemorrhage that was present within one of these carcasses. There was significant splenic hemorrhage. There was petechiation and hemorrhages on the heart, in the lungs. Bottom left, we've got thoracic blood splashing. And on the right, that's extensive hemorrhage within the bladder of one of those animals. So the clinical picture and clinical necropsy findings were very similar for both individuals. There were infarcts present throughout the viscera. And we've got a nice, clearly defined hepatic infarct from one of the animals. There was evidence of terminal cholesepticemia in both animals. Bacterial cultures from most viscera showed a heavy growth, which obviously had been to some extent the end of the animal. Bone marrow was submitted for histopathological examination. Interestingly, these cases occurred around the time of bovine neonatal pancytopenia. And these animals both contributed to research at the time because the animal health authorities at that point were looking for Bracken Toxicosis cases because they were very similar histopathologically in what we were seeing with the outbreak of bovine neonatal pancytopenia. So to some extent, these animals helped that research. And what we seen was extensive depletion of most of the cellular material within the bone marrow. There was intense hematopoiesis. And this preferential depression of myeloid series cells and megakaryocytes is very typical of Bracken toxicity. And this was the case for both individuals that were submitted for postmortem. Bracken toxicosis is sporadic, but is still significant on a global scale. Bracken is a perennial fern, which occurs in extensive pastures or unmanaged pastures throughout the world. All parts of the bracken plant or the rhizome are considered toxic. Often outbreaks or cases occur in young animals which are perhaps more inquisitive. Often if feed sources are reduced or unavailable, and this may lead to animals eating unpalatable feeds purely as an additional food source, which ultimately we'll come to, which was the case in this circumstance. Another interesting point to note and remember is drying of the plant does not remove the toxins and actually may increase the palatability and therefore increase the ingestion of the bracken rhizome itself. There are a number of tequilicides or toxins present within this plant that are responsible for the different syndromes that are noted in the literature. We've got an aplastic anemia factor causing a profound bone marrow suppression, as was the case in this case report. There's a carcinogenic glycoside associated with the more chronic form of Bracken toxicosis that we see, called enzootic hematuria. There's also cyanogenic glycoside. There is, in addition, a thiaminase, but that does not have any effect in ruminants, but will have an effect on monogastric species due to their inability to create their own thiamine, unlike cattle. So the toxins act on the bone marrow and cause a profound bone marrow-derived coagulopathy, as was the case here, and this pancytopenia. Clotting times will be increased, as was the case with these animals, and there will be an increased susceptibility to infections. Obviously, if we've got extensive bleeding throughout the animal, particularly into the lungs, we will have a perfect bacterial media for overgrowth and leading to these terminal septicemias. But it is worth remembering that anemia will be less severe than the thrombocytopenia, based purely on the fact the red blood cells have a longer half-life than the platelets. So conclusions. Tequilicide toxicity should always be considered in any case of bovine anemia. It should always be remembered that ingestion of bracken causing acute disease disease can occur up to 6 weeks after animals have been removed from an infected pasture. The client was warned at the time of this outbreak that in the group of 40, the chance of further cases was likely. No further cases did occur over the following weeks. These animals were monitored closely. Now we come on to why this occurred in the first place. The animals were young. So I've said earlier in the presentation, they may be more naive or more inquisitive in terms of what they ingest. And at the time, which is rare for the UK, but we were having an experience in a period of drought. The farm had received little rainfall over the previous 2 months, and all available grass had been eaten. There was extensive scorching within the paddock, and food availability was reduced with no additional buffer feed provided by the farmer. When I actually walked the pasture, it extended quite high, up to 13,000 feet above sea level. There was a large area of bracken fern present, very much on the upper slopes, which was further away and not easily accessible. And there was evidence of extensive grazing by the herd. So these animals had utilized this bracken fern as an additional feed source. And obviously these two affected animals had obviously ingested more than their cohorts and had been more susceptible and resulted in clinical outbreak. The shortage of this grass caused extensive grazing of the bracken fern and led to the occurrence of acute Bracken toxicosis. As in any toxicosis case, it's always important to remember to walk the pastures or walk the paddocks where the animals are grazed. If you don't walk the area, you can miss things. Things won't be seen. The client, whilst he was aware there was bracken on the upper slopes of the paddock, anytime he had went on his daily visit to the herd, the animals were all in the lower slopes. So he had no need to go higher up and hadn't actually realized to the extent the animals had been grazing this bracken. All animals that had been on that pasture were moved to a silage aftermath and monitored closely over the next 4 to 6 weeks, and there was no further cases. I'd just like to thank the local APHA in Cumbria and Penrith for their assistance, and also to the farm staff and veterinary staff who assisted with this case outbreak. Thank you.